We are in step 3 of the 12 steps of becoming a compassionate person. For Karen Armstrong, this step is about having compassion for oneself. So when we think of compassion for oneself, she connects it to self-love. A whole host of things come to mind. I mean, it's from anything from elephant man's struggle with his physical being to Narcissus, face down, focused on the pond of water in his reflection, to Woody Allen's shocking reminder that masturbation is sex with someone you love. For those of you embarrassed by that, just remember we are in a church that has comprehensive sexuality education, okay? So just get over that. That's okay. All right. Self-love, compassion for oneself. What does this mean? We've been struggling with this all week. Someone in our class said it could be as simple as just self-care. Just doing simple things like paying the bills or taking care of one's needs. And Vicki over here said, it's like if you're going to care for someone else, you have to care for yourself first. It's like being on an airplane. They say you put the mask on first before you help the person next to you, right? So compassion for self, where do we go with that? It's a complicated affair. At first blush, it seems simple, but it's not. And it brings to mind two Hebrew concepts, two concepts from Judaism and our Jewish brothers and sisters. The one concept comes out of the Hebrew word din, D-I-N, which means judgment. That excessive, critical voice that we have within that can border on prejudicial thinking for oneself and for others. And din is contrasted with rachamim, which is a kind of clarity of mind, a kind of clarity that does not cloud one's vision of objective experiences or one's own observations of oneself and others. So din and rachamim are instructive in this task. Because I bet that most of us live somewhere between that excessive self-critique and that clarity of mind that sees oneself for who it is. You may have the kind of inner dialogue that represents one or the other or both. But I'm willing to bet, and this is maybe where the Father's Day tie is if you were raised in a home where din was the main lesson, your dialogue says to you first, you can't, or you will not, or you are not enough. But if you were brought up with this din, maybe you didn't have to be Jewish to be raised with that, I guarantee it. Someone in our class said they were raised in a church that said, we are sinners in the eyes of God. That kind of mentality that we are sinners in the eyes of God is the concept of din. The critique, the self-monitoring. And if you grew up with that, you probably ran all the way to the confessional with your problems or to a personal rebellion, which maybe landed you here in this church. But if you are raised with rachamim, you have eyes which may be filled with love and admiration for others, a sense that you can shape your reality in a positive way. That inner dialogue of rachamim says, have respect for yourself and others, that you are enough. Now, Karen Armstrong didn't mention din or rachamim, but these terms have everything to do with her third step in our summer exploration. In this chapter, she urges us to find a sense of self-love or appreciation before we can move on to compassion for others. On page 90 of her book, she says, "Do not leave this step until you have laid the foundations for a healthy, realistic assessment of yourself and made the meditation on loving yourself a regular part of your day. Once you have started to feel a genuine compassion for yourself, you will be able to extend it to others." To which I say, now we are in serious trouble. Put a halt to our book study week and study this step for the rest of the summer. Because if you're anything like me, I have not mastered this compassion for myself. But I live each moment of my life somewhere between this self-critique and this self-acceptance, this understanding. It's one of the hardest things to do, to live in the balancing point between those things. And beyond those on the spectrum are self-loathing or self-destructive behaviors, which we have all been at one time. And also on the other side is narcissistic behaviors, where we are the center of all things. The interesting thing is that this self-loathing becomes narcissistic if we let it. And so how do we live in the balancing point between those aspects of life? Armstrong says this is an ancient battle, that the fears we carry lead us to despising ourselves for being cowards, or just being old, or being lonely, or failing at what we do, or failing each other. The fears we carry lead us down that side of the spectrum. She says that we can find ways to recoil from ourselves with disgust, put ourselves down at every turn, and become hyper-conscious of our faults. But if we do this, she warns, we will become excessively self-conscious, mired in the insecure ego we are trying to transcend. So she says the antidote to this problem that we all live in is to just make a list of your good qualities like her friend the rabbi. Write down all your talents and achievements. Write down all the ways in which you have helped people, the good things you have done, the successes you have had at home and at work. I recommend this to you as a strategy for today's spiritual practice. But I warn you, don't get too carried away. Because self-compassion has its limits. The goal is not to live in a deep compassion and love for yourself, but actually to dethrone ourselves from the center of our attention. To dethrone ourselves. Even while appreciating ourselves and our place in the world, it is to separate all of who we are and what we have accomplished from our own egos. And this now is leaning toward Buddhism and Karen Armstrong's deep love of the Eastern religions. As I was exploring this, I found this piece that is attributed to Charlie Chaplin, but I think in there are some more tools. Some tools that ask us to do a self-assessment and see what it says to us about how we believe in ourselves or have compassion for ourselves. Here's some of what he read. He said, "To love myself, I found that anguish and emotional suffering are only warning signs. I was living against my own truth. Authenticity, the goal." He wrote, "As I began to love myself, I stopped craving for a different life." Maturity. He said, "As I began to love myself, I quit stealing my own time. Today, I do what brings me joy and happiness." Simplicity. He urged, "As I began to love myself, I freed myself of anything that is not good for my health, food, people, things, situation. Love for oneself. Wise words. If you want a copy of that entire piece, we will give it to you. But what it's asking is for us to consider all the ways in which what we do in the world reflects back how we feel about ourselves, how we understand, how we have compassion for ourselves, and then how and if we can reach out to help others. Hearing these words urging us to accept ourselves fully, I thought of this fabulously inspiring book written by Philip Simmons called Learning to Fall. It was written many years ago. Learning to Fall. You should read this book. Simmons had Lou Gehrig's disease. He was confronted with the degeneration of his body and his life in a way most of us are not. He wrote about having a terminal condition, and he said he saw it as a blessing. He said having the facts of his mortality pushed him toward acceptance of his self in a way that most of us aren't pushed. He wrote this of the acceptance. I quote, not resignation, not passivity, but a profound and thorough acceptance of our place in the natural order. Not only must we accept our own deaths as a necessary part of that order, but we must come to see that it is our very mortality that calls us to act according to our highest nature. Here again, Simmons knows that when we know we must die, we are pushed toward love, toward a profound freedom from our own self-righteousness and our own self-critique. We are pushed away from Deen to Rahmanin. To know this creates a freedom from the need for fame, from the prisons of fear, from the endearment of our possessions, and even the approach to our bodies, be it love or despair. Comes acceptance. Simmons, like the Buddha himself, wrote, "We set aside fear and discover the love and compassion are the highest human endowments. And out of our compassion, we deal justly with those about us, not just on our good days, not just when it's convenient, but everywhere and at all times we are free to act according to that which is highest in us." For him to reach out to others begins with self-acceptance and compassion. A man who was faced with the degeneration of his own body, the imminent death of suffocation, tells us that self-love starts with giving ourselves a break. It starts with detaching from the expectations sown in us by our families of origin. It starts with listening to our intuitive selves, to hear those words that we say here often, that we are blessed. It starts with pushing aside all the things we think we must do and asks us to find a moment to appreciate what we must know, which is that life is good. And I thought a lot about this week, as is my job. And believe me, what I realized was I'm as flawed at self-compassion as anybody. I can hardly find that equanimity to allow my emotional interior some slack. I can hardly do that from moment to moment, but I try. And I believe it's important. And I believe that if all else fails, if you cannot let your interior life be, if you cannot live as if standing on the river and allowing the river of emotions and events in your life to pass through, if you cannot live into more rachamim and less din, then it is a time for a reminder that life is good. It is time for a moment of pleasure. And all this led me to this beautiful poem by Tony Hoagland, which I want to close with today. It's called The Word. And he writes this: down near the bottom of the crossed out list of things you have to do today, between green thread and broccoli, you find that you have penciled sunlight. Resting on the page, the word is beautiful. It touches you as if you had a friend and sunlight were a present he had sent from someplace distant as this morning to cheer you up and to remind you that among your duties, pleasure is a thing that also needs accomplishing. Do you remember that time and light are kinds of love, and love is no less practical than a coffee grinder or a safe spare tire? Tomorrow you may be utterly without a clue, he says, but today you get a telegram from the heart in exile, proclaiming that the kingdom still exists, the king and queen alive, still speaking to their children, to any one of them who can find the time to sit out in the sun and listen. The kingdom is alive, he says. A reminder that within the daily grind of modern life, pleasure is a thing that needs accomplishing. And pleasure may be a key to understanding that we are blessed. And understanding we are blessed is certainly a key to loving oneself and having compassion for oneself in this moment, in this time. So are we ready for step 4? I don't know. I kind of doubt it, actually. But next week we move on into empathy. Next week we move on. But don't stop having compassion for yourself this week and noticing how that moves in you and moves in your soul. We will see you Wednesday, and if not, then next Sunday, hopefully. Be well, friends. Amen.